Thank you, and thank you for having me here tonight. My name's Lisa Timothy. I'm the director at the East Lyme Public Library. For several years, I've been interested in promoting the critical history of the farm, which is now known as the York Correctional Facility. York is the only women's prison in Connecticut. I'm going to just give a brief overview of tonight's presentation, and then I'll introduce the other two speakers who will do the bulk of the presentation. I first became interested in the history of York when I was leading book discussion groups at the library. I've been doing that for about 14 years, and we've read several books on the Holocaust, and with any book on the Holocaust, you talk about what would it have been like to have been in Germany and had a prison in the middle of your town, and would you have known what was going on in it? And that takes kind of a different spin in East Lyme, because we do have a Raisin Wire prison in the middle of our town. And the conversation was really interesting to me, and I began to think, what role does this institution play in East Lyme? I also was aware that senior citizens would often come into the library and talk to me about growing up in the town and being part of the farm. They would learn to swim in Bridebrook Lake, which is a lake on the grounds of the prison. They would do that with the inmates. They would get some of their food supplies there, milk. It was truly a working farm. They would buy food there. Their parents worked there, etc. The younger people in the town seem to have almost no idea that the prison exists, or they know it's there, but they have no other connection whatsoever. And it indicates an abrupt break in the town's history, where the prison used to be part of the town, and then all of a sudden it became less visible. I also volunteered at the prison for a year as part of the college and prison program that Quinnipiac University was doing. They do one class a semester. I was sort of an embedded librarian. I would help get research materials, and I would run the study hall. And I was deeply impressed by the academic caliber of some of the students in that program. I think that people who haven't been inside a prison often don't understand anything about what they're like, and it's kind of designed that we don't understand what prisons are like these days. They're not what they seem from the outside, and they're often very, very complicated institutions. As I mentioned, York is Connecticut's only state prison for women. This is a picture of it here. York was founded as the Connecticut State Farm for Women 100 years ago last summer, July 10th, 1918. The farm, as it was known, became the Connecticut State Prison for Women in 1968, on July 1st, 1968, almost 50 years to the day after it was founded. And then it was eventually renamed York Correctional Institution, and that's how it's known these days. As Paul Harrison will describe in great detail, there were decades of battle in the state legislature to get the farm built. Legislatures and the public argued for years over what to do with women who were addicted, mentally ill, affected by other public health issues, women who were prostitutes, and had babies that were born out of wedlock. They also fought about the use of public versus private funds to confront and deal with these problems. Sadly, many of those issues are the same arguments we're having today. When you look at the history, it can be very frustrating, because you realize in 100 years, the needle seems to have hardly moved in terms of how to handle these problems. And in some ways, it seems like they've regressed. On the other hand, we do have 100 years of history, and it's really important to understand the history of this institution if you're going to understand how to, as a society, confront these problems. Prison reform is on a lot of people's minds, and the pendulum is swinging back toward a more progressive approach to dealing with criminal justice. What people don't realize is we've been here before, and it's important to understand the history, to understand where the progressive movement went off course at some point, and left us where we are today, so that we make sure that going through, as the pendulum swings back and forth, we're more effective in how we deal with these matters. We also study the history in East Lyme because it's part of our town's history. Last summer, we sponsored, at the 100th anniversary, we had talks, we had Paul Talk, we had book discussions, a picture gallery, and a performance by the Judy Doran Project, which is formerly incarcerated women who do theater performance about their experiences. So why is this important to women? This is a Women's History Month presentation. Prominent women were involved with the prison's history. Women's prisons were one of the few places 100 years ago where women could have a public career. A number of women were influential in operating the farm. This was very much an institution run by women, for women, with women in mind. The prominent women included Elizabeth Munger, the first significant warden of the Connecticut State Farm for Women. Okay, small picture of her, you can't see it very well, but this is Elizabeth Munger. She studied with John Dewey as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. She was one of the first women to graduate from the University of Chicago. And she went on to work with Catherine Davis of Hull House, Davis being one of the founders of the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. They were both part of a progressive movement that were setting up institutions to help women who needed help in getting through whatever they were going through. Gladys Tantaquigian, I hope I said that right, is a local Mohegan medicine woman. Most of us know her from the casino fame locally, but she was an educated anthropologist. She did her degree at University of Pennsylvania, and she later went on to serve as the farm's librarian and an educator for minority women during the late 1940s. The Connecticut State Farm for Women insisted on providing female physicians as much as possible, and at one point the farm employed women trained as doctors in China. They brought them in from China because they didn't have enough American women to work at the farm. And Paul will tell you about another important woman, Anne Rogers Minor. I don't want to steal his thunder, so he can talk about that later. In time, the farm became a model for how women's prisons should be run. People came from all over the world to understand how things were done in Niantic. Buildings resembling a college campus were built to teach women job, educational, recreational, and life skills. There we go. This is a picture of the Industrial Arts Building. It's also known as Hazen Hall. Women were housed in cottages. Can you do the next picture? They were housed in cottages that were supposed to resemble and serve as homes rather than an institution. Women who were incarcerated at the farm took part in activities resembling those that looked like they would be more at home at a college campus than at a prison. If you can do the next one. This is a May Day pole ceremony. Again, you know, you see more of a Seven Sisters College here than you do a women's prison. Which is important because the prison and the colleges were born of the same seed pod, really, the same movement at that time. Just one went on to become a very empowering institution for women, and one became devastating for women. And I just think that's an interesting juxtaposition. Change throughout American society in the mid-20th century led to the decline of farming and the more progressive aspects of the farm for women. In 1968, control of the prison was turned over to the State Department of Corrections. The women running the prison and their progressive ideas were replaced almost exclusively by a male department. This change took place almost 50 years to the day. By the early 1980s, a new maximum security facility was built. That was the picture I had up first. And that institution was built to support the war on drugs and to fuel the mass incarceration problem that we see today. The institution was named York Correctional Institution after Janet York, the last of the women wardens during the more progressive first half of the institution's history. Today's women scholars are starting to uncover the important history of the farm and other women's prisons. Celeste Gander, an undergraduate at Trinity University, is writing her honors thesis in human rights this year, and she's focusing on the founding of the farm and what that meant at that time. Dr. Mary Phillips of City University of New York is studying the prison experience of former Black Panther member Erica Huggins during her incarceration at the Connecticut State Farm during the years 1968 to 1970. If you recall, there was a famous New Haven trial in 1970 with the Black Panthers. The women Panthers were held in Niantic during that time. And Dr. Phillips is writing a book on this topic. And finally, the Indiana Women's Prison Program is studying a similar women's prison in Indiana. That project is head up by Dr. Kelsey Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman worked at the Connecticut State Farm for a year after she was one of the first women to graduate from Yale College. She understands correctional institutions from an employee perspective and values what employees and COs have to say about them. Just as importantly, Dr. Kaufman also understands and outright insists on the importance of including incarcerated women when producing the history of a women's prison. Incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women know things that the rest of us don't, and they ask the right questions. Incarcerated women in Indiana have produced and published a scholarly level and award-winning work about the history of the Indiana women's prison, and that couldn't have been written by anyone but them. We are looking for ways to include the perspective of directly impacted women when understanding the history of the farm. We haven't been as successful as we'd like in doing that. We're still working on that. So now I'm going to turn this over to our two other speakers. Paul Harrison is a retired correctional officer, and John Carboni is going to tell us a special story about a woman that was incarcerated there.
My name is Paul Harrison. I'd like to welcome everybody. I just retired from York Correctional Institution March 1st of last year. I cannot believe a year flew by already. I was born a Navy brat in the DeWitt Naval Hospital in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Father's a Navy man, 5 boys, 2 girls. After graduating Stonington High School, I went to work at Electric Boat in Groton for 12 years, building the nuclear submarines there. I enjoyed that work very much. I then went to Millstone for 8 years, 5 years as an armed security officer, 4 making the pistol team. I enjoyed that. My career in the Department of Corrections started February 13th, 1998. It was a Friday the 13th up in Meriden. They always start the academy on a Friday, and you go up to the academy for one day, have the weekend off. And I enjoyed it up there. And from after graduating the academy, I started at the J.B. Gates Correctional Institution. J.B. Gates Correctional Institution is on the same grounds as the women's facility, the 800 acres. We take up a couple hundred acres in the corner. 1986, the men started their prison here. And so after working through all the buildings, because our population was high, we started taking over buildings of the women's prison. And I started noticing the names of them: Lucretia Shaw, Faith Trumbull, Betsy Ross, the Fenwicks, the Winthrops, and Ruth Willis. And through my through this, my thought of looking at all that came the following presentation. Again, we just had the 100th anniversary of the Connecticut State Farm. At the chapel, we have that day we honored 2 people: Ann Rogers Minor, who was the matriarch of the facility, and Janet York, who was another great importance of the person. That day in the chapel, as Deputy Warden Scarmazzino, she's a real fun person, put a carnation on Janet York that day. We also had a lot of dignitaries and everything. We had at least 6 or 7 of the past and previous wardens there that day. Famika, the first selectman, and Holly Cheeseman, they're all back there. We had quite a day that day. It was quite an attention. On that day, July 10th, 2018, the governor reads this proclamation. By virtue of the authority in me vested in accordance with Section 4 of Chapter 358 of Public Acts of 1917, I hereby make a proclamation that the Connecticut State Farm for Women at East Lyme, Connecticut is now open for the reception of inmates, and direct that a copy hereof under the seal of Executive Department be mailed to each judge of each city, borough, and town court, and to each judge of the Superior Court, and to each state's attorney. Dated at Hartford, this 10th day of July, 1918. Marcus H. Holcomb, Governor. He read that in Hartford. Prior to his declaration for that, actually it was a year prior, the Board of Directors were picked. William Bailey from New Haven, Connecticut. Valerie Parker from Hartford. John Goss from Waterbury. Ann Rogers Minor from Waterford, Connecticut. It says Waterford. She's from East Lyme. She grew up in East Lyme, migrated over to Waterford. State Senator Edward Hazen from Haddam, Hazen Park. It's a YMCA down there. It's named after him. George C. Clark from Plymouth, Connecticut, and Helen W. Rogers from Hamden, Connecticut. At their first board meeting, July 1st, 1917, they elected these officers: Mr. Bailey as president, Valerie Parker as secretary, and George C. Clark. These are the people that stood in front of the building that day. This is the John Lee House. They have their picture taken at the first commission. Some of them are commission members, some of them are board members, and some are from the Prison Association. From left, this is Helen Worthington Rogers. She was a chief probation officer from Marion County, Indiana. Ms. Rogers was on many of the committees that brought forth the Connecticut State Farm for Women. This last committee was an all-female committee of delinquent women set up by the Connecticut Prison Association. And he was the president, this gentleman here, of the Connecticut Prison Association. This last commission that went through wrote the law. They went all over the country, to every state in the country, took their laws from the facility, brought them back to Connecticut, went through them all, voted on it, and they came up with their own laws, and a law to proceed to the next legislative action with. The law was so well written that the federal government stepped in and wanted that law to be the model of all women's reformatories that were created after 1917, and which they were. In 1922, after the law, Miss Helen Worthington Rogers here, she, in 1922, creates and publishes a digest of laws establishing reformatories in the state of Connecticut. And she puts it on paper and publishes it. In 1929, she comes out and writes about what it took for that legislative action to pass. And she comes out with the history of a movement to establish a state reformatory for Connecticut, for women in Connecticut. She goes through the complete movement in this picture from 1864 to 1917, 53-year attempt to have a woman's prison made in the state of Connecticut. She's bold enough to say that we were even before Indiana, the first women's prison, and before Massachusetts, the second women's prison. Our legislative action started before them by 20, 30 years, even though they started their institutions first. Our legislative action, during the forum, a lot of controversy ends up coming up about the way things are running and everything. And Miss Helen Worthington Rogers was released by the governor for cause on October 24th, 1923. To come to her defense, her husband turns out, and he comes out with the episode of a history of a Connecticut institution where he comes to the defense of his wife who was just let go. The Russell Sage Foundation was called in from the governor to do an investigation, and this is the Russell Sage Foundation here. The next person on the list is Jessie D. Hodder. She's the superintendent of the Massachusetts Reformatory for Women. She's the one the state of Connecticut, we're about to start this institution, approached to use us as a guiding, as a advisory superintendent. She decided, they offered her the position, they decided that she wasn't going to do it because her institution was at a small time, it was a fledgling, and she didn't want to leave it at that point. So with the approval of the state of Massachusetts, she was paid and became our advisory superintendent that guided us through the opening of this institution. On this picture of all these people, it lists on the back who they are. Nobody lists this gentleman right here. I believe that is Board Director George C. Clark from Plymouth, Massachusetts. Mr. Clark, Mr. Goss, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Hazen, many articles of these gentlemen going to Hartford to advocate for the affairs of the woman and for the prison. Years of it. The next person here is Dr. Valerie H. Parker. She was the executive secretary of the Connecticut Social Hygiene Club. During the movement that Miss Worthington Rogers talks about, this movement was 53 years. Every 10 or 12 years, a group of people did it. The last movement, the last commission was from 1915, 1917. That movement was the one that got it done. He was the president of the Prison Association, and she's the president of the executive secretary of the Social Hygiene Club. These two people worked as advisory council to the rest of the people for when the commission and the law was written and everything. She was so active in women's suffragette that she gave over 250 speeches alone during that process. And she became so well known in the state of Connecticut for the women's suffragette that the state of Connecticut made a plaque, a bronze plaque in the state capitol of 31 of the most top women in the state of Connecticut that did this. She's a plaque of one of 31 in the state capitol, unveiled in 1935 by Governor William Wilbur Cross. If you Wikipedia, it's got a neat thing. If you Wikipedia, it will say, she's the first woman policeman ever given supervision over state policemen in the United States. These being policewomen who supervised girls in the New London, Connecticut area. I thought that was kind of interesting. The next person is Professor William B. Bailey from Yale. When Miss Helen Worthington Rogers writes in her History of the Movement, she states that Connecticut Prison Association really wasn't doing anything. It wasn't until 1910 that he took it over, and as she states, he provided the militant leadership that was needed, that was lacking up until that time. He had a bill, one bill in a few years earlier came out, got shot down. That's when he made that all-women's commission with him as the president and her as another advisory source to this commission that actually got it to go through. Some people in the state of Connecticut, there was a gentleman just wrote a book, a doctor, I forgot his name, Reverend, wrote a beautiful book on the history of the men's movement of that. And I showed him what I did. He had no idea that the women were fighting the same fight. But he gives this gentleman all the credit to do it. The next woman, the last woman, is a board of director, Anne Rogers Minor. She, Anne Rogers Minor, and the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, become the largest agitators for the inception of the Connecticut State Farm for Women. Again, I keep going back to her. She's got such a prominent history in this. In her writings of the history of the movement, and she talks about all the people, the different women's movements and groups to do this. That last window from 1915 to 1917, it was the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, that became the thorn in the side to the state of Connecticut to get this done. Miss Minor and the DAR became the loudest voice in the final campaigns and push for the legislation to establish a reformatory for the unfortunate girls without custodial care in this state. When they met in the board of directors meeting that time for that first meeting, they also did one other thing besides nominating the officers of the president and all that. They nominated a site committee of Miss Minor, Miss Parker, Edward Hazen, that's not here, and Helen Worthington Rogers. At this first meeting, site committee, they all took a vote, and it was automatically ratified. They were going to give Anne Rogers Minor complete control of the selection of the site. Some of the things that the selection of that site had to be, it had to be 200 acres or more. It had to be relatively close to a railroad station. They needed to get their supplies in. It had to have plenty of woodland for fires and tillable pasture. It had to be laid out on the cottage plan. This was a new technique. Instead of incarcerating them in the building, they were going to separate each groups of people in a cottage plan. And it had to have an exhaustible water supply. That was very, very important. Now, after looking at 21 different sites, she picks 5 old farmhouses from her friends and her neighbors. These are people from her neighbors. She lived in this town. She went to town hall meetings. She voted with these people. They were townspeople. This is 6 Boston Post Road. This is the house that her mother was born in, the house that her grandfather built. Miss Minor was an early member of the Lucretia chapter of the DAR in New London, very early. I think she's like the 6th member. She was also the first woman ever from New England elected to be the President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution. That was a big time back then. Miss Minor at the start put up her own money. They were running into problems when they had the 5 old houses. They couldn't finish. They wanted to meet that deadline. I proved that. She ended up putting her own money up in that. And again, that's why people are always surprised when I tell them it's because of Miss Minor's long, strong leadership. Our buildings are named after DAR chapters or strong women in history. Ruth Willis, Faith Trumbull, Lucretia Shaw, Lady Fenwick, Winthrop, and Betsy Ross. So now they turn around and they purchase, and she comes out and buys 5 farmhouses from her neighbors and her friends. This is the first farmhouse. It's the John Lee farmhouse. John Lee was the great-great-great-grandson of the John Lee that wrote The Dying Charge. The Dying Charge was left in the Lee house, the Thomas Lee house, up on 156. The Thomas Lee house is right across the street from this. This was his great-great-great-grandson that built this house. And they took it from Janet Hibbs. The name Ruth Willis comes from the State House in Hartford was right here. The Willis Estate was directly next to the State House in Hartford. On the Willis Estate, it had this huge, magnificent white oak tree, the charter oak that we've all come to know. In 1662, John Winthrop sailed to England to retain the charter for the colony of Connecticut. But what happened is with the succession of James II to the throne, Connecticut's troubles began in earnest. Because now in 1687, His Majesty's agent, Sir Edmund Andros, comes to the State House in Hartford with an armed militia to take that charter from Connecticut. So now they're in the State House, lights dim, the candles go out, and they panic. The lights come back on, the charter's gone. Our Connecticut charter's gone. Captain Joseph Wadsworth is credited with taking the charter and secreted it into the white oak tree on the magnificent charter oak on the Wiles Estate, saving our charter for we could become known as the Constitution State with the charter. Some people chuckle at me. All my pictures, they go, why all your pictures got fires on them? Well, this is what happened to it. In 1991, when they were building the new Janet S. York Correctional Institution, they burned it down along with this beautiful barn. This is now the Wellness Center parking lot for the facility. The second old farmhouse was the Johnson Reynolds Farm. It was Johnson's Reynolds Farm. It was bought for probate from Melissa Beckworth, and she names this the Faith Trumbull home. Faith Trumbull is the wife of Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Governor Trumbull was the only patriot governor in the state of in the colonies, the only governor to support the cause of the Revolutionary War. His wife was Faith Trumbull. Commander-in-Chief of the French Allied Forces, Count Rochambeau, were encamping on the Lebanon Town Green. If you ever not been to the Lebanon Town Green, you need to go there. It's one of the most beautiful town greens that we have in the state. As I'm counting there at the chapel on the Lebanon Town Green, the governor and his wife, Faith Trumbull, were expecting the service where they were giving out donations, rings, finger rings, cups, glasses, shoes, clothing, anything for the man in want in the army. Well, she rises from her chair, approaches the altar, takes off his magnificent scarlet cloak, a gift from the commander-in-chief of the French Allied Army himself, Count Rochambeau himself. She lays this on the altar as a gift to all the men fighting gallantly their needs and their wants. It ended up being cut in strips, sold as a lottery, raised a huge amount of money for the cause, and it set that moment into history. Also, as John would tell us there, if somebody on the radio got on there, ASAP to Chicken Hill, well, that's where the chickens were, up there. If you go in the woods there, there's many foundations of all the chickens were kept kept up there, another picture. The next farm is the Beebe house. This was bought from James Beebe. Ann Rogers Minor had a little problem when she bought this farm. He dies prior to them taking possession. But it was never a problem because Ann Minor Roger was the neighbors of all these people, voted with them, town meetings with them. It was never a problem. This is Arthur Beebe. He ends up becoming, after the purchase, the farm manager of the entire farm for the next 30 years. And he was the one who took the farming operations where we were making so much. We were supplying other Connecticut institutions, and we were doing the laundry from him, and it became a very good operation at that time. At his farmhouse, all the hands, all the male farm hands ended up. And if you go up to that S corner on North Brydebrook Road, you can still see the huge foundations in the woods from the, they had the barns and everything back there. And that's the only picture I have of this. You can look down from the barns to the foundations, and I can look right down to where that is. Yeah, like I said, the next farmhouse is going to be called the Winthrop House, the Winthrop Cottage. That was named after Governor John Winthrop Jr.'s wife, Elizabeth Winthrop. It was purchased from Nelson Havens. It was called the Nelson Havens Farm. It was purchased from John Stark. He was very, very popular, Governor Winthrop, so much so that he was elected governor, state of Connecticut. He tried to run the second time. The law, governor can't run 2 times. He became the vice governor, or whatever it is. They changed the law for the governor could run again, and he ran for another 14 terms. He was governor of the state of Connecticut until he dies. That's how much the people love this man in the state of Connecticut. So this was named after that. We had a little problem here when the Connecticut State Farm opened July 10th, 1918. Months prior to that, the federal government approached our board of directors, said, we have a little problem. We have World War I raging right now, and the girls of the night are creating havoc on the doughboys of the Groton Subbase and Camp Niantic. We need a temporary detention home for these girls. So they went back to the appropriations, our board did. They granted us $20,000 additional monies with the understanding that the federal government is going to go on the monies to run the place. So what they ended up doing on the back of these things, it's kind of neat. They ended up taking this barn. These are early pictures. They ended up taking the barn from the Winthrop house, and they connect it. Here's another very early picture. Here's the guys with the wood and everything getting ready to take in that barn, and they're building it onto the place. They finally get this massive structure all the way down in the back of it. And here's a good look of it. It's showing all the babies in the cribs. It's showing all the babies in the cribs and everything, because what happened next, this is the Betsy Ross house. When we first got there, this was our hospital. This was the facility's first hospital. When the government stopped in and wanted to put the girls in the other one, they were building a brand new hospital. We put all the babies in this house in the barn, and they started so much they filled up and they started carrying over into the Winthrop house. But this is kind of neat because this is 2 old pictures of them actually having that. And here's another early picture. You got the wood all stacked up and everything. They're building the Winthrop house right here. They're building a new addition. This is no longer the hospital. The babies are going here. So what they do is they start adding additions on these. They more additions and more additions. Then they come up and they put dormers on the top, a second floor, and even more additions. It fills up with children so much that they started overflowing into the Winthrop house. But they changed that later. We'll talk about that. Women at the facility, they birthed almost 200 children a year illegitimate children of the year on this facility, inmates' babies. Don't forget, this is 1930-something, 1940-something. You're pregnant, you didn't have a husband. They picked you up and you went. You were living with your boyfriend, and your neighbor found out you were living there. They brought you to the farm. This is the last farm. This is the 1750 home of John L. Smith. It was bought for probate from Margaret Allen. All the board of directors meetings, they always refer this to the Allen House, Again, as I was telling you, when the Betsy Ross filled up, the Winthrop House filled up, the superintendent lived in the Winthrop House. They had nowhere to put her. This now becomes the superintendent's house. And this was very late 1919, early 1920. And this becomes the superintendent's house. And it was all the way up until Janet S. York, the last occupant that our generation knows it by. There's another picture of it. Now, with a place to call their own, they now need a superintendent. Jessie Harder, the superintendent for Massachusetts Reformatory for Women, she was asked to be it. She neglected. Now they need somebody, so now they bring in the matron from the state prison in Wethersfield, Miss A.C. Littlefield, and her assistant, who was a practical nurse, Miss Emma J. Stiles. They opened the place July 13th with the first girl from New Britain, Miss Helen Pratt. With our country involved in total war at this time, they needed to find a superintendent. That was hard. All the people out fighting the war, they couldn't get doctors. They couldn't get a psychologist. They were all in the war effort. So at this time, they come and they hire Dr. Elizabeth E. Entz. She was a physician at the Norwich State Hospital. She came from the Norwich State Hospital. Everybody prior to her was a temporary assistant or a superintendent. She becomes now the official first superintendent of the Connecticut State Farm for Women, and in official records from 1918 to 1990, 1919, she's listed as such. Not long after the arrival of Mrs. Entz, the board of directors promote the director of education, Miss Wilhelmina Kay, as the acting superintendent. She's now listed in the official records as the second superintendent of the Connecticut State Farm, 1919-1920. Miss Entz goes back to Norwich State Hospital. And it began as the war, they find it hard to find somebody with correctional experience. All these women are doing else things. Now they find and they get Miss Anna M. Peterson. They now get a woman with correctional experience and administration competence. She was a psychologist at Slayton Farms in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's women's facility. She was the superintendent at the Virginia Home for Girls at one time. So they now finally get a woman. At the same time, Miss Peterson comes and is our new superintendent at the State Farm. Miss Minor now opens the newest building on the building, Fenwick Hall. Again, they're all pictures of fire. I like to get some good pictures of them. Ground was broken May 17th, 1920 for this building. Prior to this, they had 5 old farmhouses and 1 rickety cow barn. This is the first new building at the Connecticut State Farm for Women. Problem is, they built it out of wood. They built it wood. Again, they named it Fenwick Hall. They named it after Lady Fenwick. She dies in 1948, Lady Fenwick does, for complications of birth. She was the wife of the governor of Saybrook Colony, George Fenwick. After her birth, he's stuck there all by himself, so he goes back to England. He goes over and talks to Matthew Griswold in Saybrook, the Lyme colony. He offers him 900 acres of prime land if him and his descendants agree to take care of the tomb in Cypress Cemetery and care for the tomb of Lady Fenwick. And for 370 years, it was just in the paper 3 years ago, This family of Matthew Griswold's, called Blackhall, still takes care of the tomb in Cypress Cemetery of Lady Fenwick, just doing a major reconstruction of it not that long ago. Now with a lot of problems that are coming about the farm, again, I told you before, a lot of things coming about. They were talking about Miss Peterson, the way she's treating the girls. They had a lot of problems about the farming operations, how much it costs, and the need of new buildings, and the treatments of the inmates from Miss Peterson and her assistant, Miss Richards. Some of them were, they would crop your hair if you ran away or got returned from violation of probation. Profanity, you were to be silent for 2 hours, with 1 hour additional for each further offense. Story carriers had to wash dishes for a week. For quarreling, you had to shovel coal for the day. And disrespect to a matron, you had to scrub the floors for a whole week. Miss Peterson is now let go because as we go back into Helen Worthing Rogers, when the Sage Foundation come in, this foundation comes in, they release her, the board of directors is gone, and now what they do, they hire the education director, Helen Hazen. But then after that, the controversy, they now hire Miss Elizabeth Munger. Here's a picture of Miss Elizabeth Munger with Mr. Beebe, present her with the watch at her, Miss Elizabeth Munger's retirement. After the investigation, a lot of finger pointing, the Connecticut State Farm for Women hires Miss Munger. She takes the reins. She brings, July 1st, 1926, and it's Miss Munger that brings the State Farm to national acclaim for the treatment and incarceration of women in this country. She brings us people from all over the world came and were using this as a study, this Connecticut State Farm for Women, of how this all worked, and went back to their facilities and did it. But now, you don't remember, she just took over the farm after the Russell Sage and all these major complaints that were just happening. And during the Russell Sage Foundation, the biggest complaint on this Russell Sage Foundation was the conditions of the babies at the farm, described as kept in a run-down old cow barn, the Betsy Ross picture. And that's exactly what it was. It was a run-down old cow barn. So now, now what she does, she's now brand new. She approaches the legislature and the board of directors. She wants to rent a house in Black Point to put all the babies in so they can build a brand new hospital. This is the home they took at Pleasant Drive Extension in Black Point. It was owned by Albert A. Wiggin. He was a farmer. He was raising pigeons. A squab, they called it. Squab is the same thing as veal is to cows. Squab is to pigeons. It's processed at a very young age, even though he had chickens and other things that he sold. It was a pretty big operation and a pretty big farm he had there. And he did it for a while. We rented it, and we put 65 children and their inmates in this little tiny, so they stayed there for 2 years until the new pediatric hospital was completed, the Dr. Thompson Hall, out of Howell in 1927. Now with Miss Munger and Miss Miner's leadership, Miss Munger runs the farm for 21 years, and they built the plant well with the new buildings of farming operations, and the farm became very, very profitable. So I'm going to quickly just run through the buildings. The first building they built, 5 old farmhouses and a cow barn. First building they built is Fenwick Hall, the first wooden building. Now that burned down in 37. So in 1925, they opened this in 26. They did the first building, the new Lucretia Shaw. This is named she was named after Nathaniel Shaw in the chapter of the DAR in New London. Nathaniel Shaw was the Navy attaché for George Washington during the war. Anything that floated, sails, rope, people, hardtack, was all done out of that building. Lucretia Shaw was his wife and entertained in their beautiful mansion. All the prison ships came in the New London River with the sick and the dying. She was bringing them into her mansion house where George Washington slept and taking care of him. She ended up getting sick, and she ends up dying of gold fever and all that. And to honor her, this was the first fireproof construction. The next building, like I said, where they had the hospital. There were no babies because they had no hospital. They just had the hospital. Then when the government stepped in to build a hospital on Winthrop, they turned the baby center over to them. Munger comes in, not doing too good, goes to Alberta Farm. Well, Alberta Farm they're in there for 2.5 years. This is the building that they're building. Started on 1927, opened in 28. This was a state-of-the-art pediatric hospital when it was built. Thompson Hall, birthing rooms, inmate quarters, dietitian kitchens. They did over 200 births between the two buildings. It was always called the Babies Hospital until in 1933, Dr. Ida Thompson, the president of the board of directors, dies, and it now becomes Thompson Hall. Big building. They were all very big buildings. This was an addition done on the 1930. They put poles down here where you can't drive a vehicle in anymore to support this, and they needed more room for the babies. They did a lot of additions in 1930. The next building is Hazen Hall. This was called the Industrial Building. They finally got the building for the library, the school classes, the sewing classes, gymnasium. They always wanted this building. This was named Hazen Hall. Well, we all call it Industrial Building, but official name was Hazen Hall after State Senator Edward Hazen. Here's the interior of it. This is a complicated story. This is called the North Building, or the prison unit. This was the administration building for the Gates Correctional Institution when it started. This was the prison unit has a very, very neat history. So when they started the farm, the 53-year struggle we're talking about, that it took to start the farm, well, it didn't end for 60-something years, because the fight was all about the 14 girls that were being housed in the Wethersfield state prison. They wanted them out of there. They were being mistreated. It wasn't good up there. So the fight of our farm in 1918 was to get them out. When we first opened the first buildings, they wanted those girls to come and open the farm, but they decided they were too far away. It wouldn't be a safe idea, so we didn't do it. So finally in 1930, to end that mission, that 53-year mission, and it took 66 years, they finally got the woman, the 14 girls out of the state prison in Wethersfield, and this building, huge building, was housed just for those 14 girls that showed up that day. Janet York will always tell you, she goes, you notice it's the only building on the entire compound that has bars in the windows. There's another view. Again, I spent much time up on the second floor here. This was our administration building. And we housed some of the girls up top there also. This is a neat picture. The board of directors minutes were so very proud when they wanted to build a machine shed that at time of economy, they didn't have much money in 23, that the inmates did the construction, they digging out themselves. They were very, very happy with that. And this is the building that they built. The up top here, they started from the train station getting the coal in boxes, and now they could bring the coal, and they lined up the coal right up in the top, and then they could put all their farm equipment down in the back. This is Davis Hall. This was named after one of the leaders in women penology, Dr. Catherine Beevement Davis. She started the Bedford Hills, and in Rockefeller, with Rockefeller, the famous Rockefeller, they started a facility of social hygiene for the girls up there. She was very instrumental in women's penology and bringing forth this whole thing. So when in 1930 we were doing additions, and we needed another building after Fenwick Hall burned down, the new medical building. This was it. It was called Davis Hall. It ended up one of the biggest buildings on the compound because it became the new reception building, and it had all the medical services and everything on it. They were pretty big buildings. The next building, this is the administration building that you see out in 156. It was done in 1930 also. They needed administration and everything now. They ended up putting an addition on it in 1951 because they ended up needing a little more room, so they put this addition on it. This is the laundry. This is a pretty neat room what they had to do. This entire thing is the laundry area. You go in there, they have ironing boards, sweatshops, and it's a sweatshop. All this industrial going on in this building. They ended up doing all the laundry for Oral School, Seaside, and a few other places for profit, and they ended up doing it. What was convenient about this building, one side was the laundry, the other side was the cannery. In here, they canned all the fruits. They had the big vases, barrels in there with the peas, grapes, and they made all the jellies and everything. And they actually did all the canning in this side. Again, these are very nice buildings that they did here. And this was the back of it, like I was saying. They thought that was so neat that the back of it, the whole garden came right up to the back of this building. This is the storehouse. In 1930, they did the same thing. This is called the Wellness Center. We all do our correctional classes up here, and has a gymnasium in the basement for all the seed, the clothing. This is your office, Locksmith's office. It lives right down there. All that stuff that ended up going in here. They used to keep everything scattered throughout the facility, the attics of all the buildings, and they said, we can't do this anymore. And this is the storehouse they built. I'm showing you again Hazen Hall, because in 1930, when they started doing other additions, this used to be just a 6-window building. They ended up putting an extension on this with the gymnasium, putting dressing facilities on either side and everything, and they put a power sewing room on the other side. And the very last grouping of buildings that they built was in 1938. This is the Faith Trumbull building. They recycled the names of the old cottages that they were using. They put staff up there, and these were the new buildings. This one's gone. This one's gone now. This is the Faith Trumbull. On all the other buildings that they built prior, they liked this little thing that they put on the side. That was in case somebody had tuberculosis. They had an outdoor, here it is right here. On a nice Friday night during the basketball game and the card games, we had men in here. You could hear them 6.5 miles away screaming as they're slamming the dominoes and playing their card games. Now these were very big buildings. These are huge buildings. York Correctional Institution started in 1995. Does all the cooking for, I forgot what district it is, District 3 or whatever. For statewide, they do all the cooking? I thought it was just for the district. This used to be, before the York was built in 94, these were the kitchens here in the basement that did the same thing. They supplied all the food. In between the Trumbull building and the Fenwicks, they have this beautiful plaque done from the Public Works Administration, the governor, and everybody. And that leads us to the next building, the Fenwick building, which was the next to the last building. The Fenwicks and the Trumbulls are sister buildings. Just a very few 4,800 square foot, 2,200 square foot difference in the buildings, but it is just a little different. And you can see the back end, big buildings. This goes down in, and Miss Munger, with the retirement of her deputy, the superintendent, Miss Elsie Shear, the same one that she had in New Jersey State Home for Girls, replaces the superintendent. The playbook that Ms. Munger wrote about the treatment of the incarcerated in their training and education instead of their idleness will continue for many years until the next generation. But now, with a fire at the superintendent's house, they lose one of the largest barns that we had on the property and everything. So they turn now and they rent across the street. They end up renting the Bohan property. The Bohan property is kind of interesting because right next to it is the old John Lee farmhouse, salt box, and all that. In 1912, when the John Lee house was given to the Historical Society, just the house was. The gigantic barn in back and the 120 acres that wrapped around this house went to this house. So we ended up renting it for a year and then ended up purchasing it for a year. Mr. Watrous, I believe his name was the laundryman for many, many years, ended up living in this house. The East Lyme uses it for a tourist information center, I think now, or with other things that they do at the in 1936, a big thing happened at the prison. Here's the prison, 156, 95 Bride Lake. Here's where the down dump is in East Lyme, the dumps. They owned everything up the Riverview and all the way around. There was one problem. The Superintendent's House and the Winthrop House. Mr. Havens had a right-of-way to his ice pond back there. And it was a thorn in the side for all them years. They finally purchased in 1931 the right-of-way, and now they own the continuous property. And they ended up going out here. They ended up going out here and building up the pond around. And if you look at the 34 aerial photographs, you can see the beautiful ice house and the thing that goes out into the water. So I go running out there, investigating all the property and everything. I'm looking at the foundation. I go, what is this? I didn't know they built something out of it. I go, it's not an ice house. You're not having a fireplace in the basement of an ice house. I knew that wasn't happening. So what I come to find out is they built a recreation center. They raised the elevation, they knocked the ice house down, and they built for the girls to go swimming and everybody else to go swimming out there. More changes to come when Miss Shea retires and Miss Elizabeth McKenzie becomes superintendent on May 21st, 1953. She was the assistant superintendent in North Jersey Training School. Miss McKenzie has her deputy, Miss Emily Howard. She came from Long Lane School. But now with the death of our matriarch was Ann Rogers Minor. Now when she died, Miss Eleanor Little comes in to take her places. Before I touch her, I want to show you some of the things that you could be arrested for and charged with. This is 1942, 1943, what you could be arrested for and brought to here. Lascivious carnage, manifest danger, fortification, I guess. Fornication, I guess that's just if you adultery, neglected children, soliciting vagrant, lewdness, night walking, theft, abandonment, children. These are some of the things you can do. Now Ms. Howard wants to retire with 34 years of state service. This is when Janet York becomes now the deputy superintendent on April 30th, 1957. After Ms. McKenzie retires, Janet York is voted to be the superintendent by the vote of the Board of Directors on October 15, 1960. And with the professional and cordial working relationship, 7 years behind them, Mr. Clyde Littlefield and the superintendent marry in 1967 and take up residence on the grounds. I want to quickly backtrack to go back to here. Now we had two places. We had the Connecticut State Farm for women, the Connecticut State Prison for women. You saw the State Farm. This is the state prison. Murder charges at 2, manslaughter 2, arson, abortion, attempted to do adultery, stealing, and that with that. But I want to go back to Miss Little, who takes over from Ann Rogers Minor. Just a quick brief history. She was born December 9th, 1885. She got a BA in history in 1908. She became a matron in Slayton Farms, Pennsylvania until 1913. She got bored of that and went back and got her master's in 1915. She got bored of back to school, went back to New Jersey Correctional in Clinton Farms. And she stayed there for a number of years. She got bored of that. She must have went to school, became an engineer. She went to New Jersey and went to New Haven and became an engineer for U.S. Rubber. After a few years there, New Haven plant closed. They went to New York. Then she goes all the way to 1930 as an engineer in the New York office. She gets bored of that, and in 1931, she turns to the government service again, and she becomes the secretary for the Connecticut Employment Commission. And in 1933, she becomes the secretary of the Connecticut Emergency Relief Commission. During this time, Rocky Neck State Park was built. We have all these letters going back to the State Farm of how many horses and wagons you need, how many men, did you need the ox cart or the truck this week? And there's the list of what it's going to cost and everything. I thought that was really neat. In 1941, she's elected a representative from Guilford to the General Assembly. In 1945, she was re-elected, and she died in March 15, 1986. She came to the board after the death of the treasurer, John Goss, in October 16, 1944. So when she comes, she's the treasurer. Ann Rogers Minor dies. She ends up becoming the chairman of the board. Now with I already did that, I think. Now with the real strong mind, will of mind and body, these two ladies, Miss Little and Miss Janet York, these two ladies lead the state of Connecticut, a woman through its most tumultuous times. This Miss York is the chairman of the board, and Janet York is the superintendent. They're there to combat this new DOC idea. The governor now, they've been trying for 12 years to ram this new DOC idea down their throat. You got to remember, all these institutions, Long Lane, Norwich State Hospital, run by board of directors. Now the governor says, no, we're going to eliminate all your board of directors, and we're going to take over. They didn't want that. There's a long, long history of this fight. The Connecticut State Farm for Women, after its rocky start, would become the model of all the penal institutions, men and women, led by a man or a woman in the state of Connecticut, and the country as a whole, the globe. People will come from all ends of the earth to study the results that happened at this farm for many years in this operation and wonder how it sustained the results far above all the other institutions in the company. And that was when the Department of Corrections took over. With Miss Little and Miss York, were now the guiding force to get the girls of the institution the fair deal. They were the ones that got them a fair deal, with Miss Eleanor Little becoming the vice chairman of the Connecticut Council of Corrections. Miss York becomes the deputy commissioner of women's services. Miss York had a seat of the board of directors of the American Correctional Institution and was president of the Women's Correctional Association. But she will always be remembered as the last great warden of the Connecticut State Prison for Women and the last great superintendent of the Connecticut State Farm for Women. And this is when, after they started opening the new facility, this is the thing they opened it up in 1994, and was now dedicated as the new Janet S. York Correctional Institution. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Before I get into my story, and we're talking about Women's Month, I have a lot of women to honor. Basically because my story starts with I had two mothers. I have two wives, second wife of 25 years. I have four sisters. I have four daughters. And where do I work? So my first question for you is, how many of you started life as a parole violation? Anybody? Oh, well, I guess I'm all alone on that. Basically, yep, that is my thing. I was a parole violation. My biological mother, Audrey, had been charged with lascivious carriage, which you saw up on the chart, which was one of the highest things. Basically what that was my older sister, Stephanie, she was pregnant with her first. Her father was underage. Audrey was like 19, he was like 16 or 17. So his mother had Audrey charged with this lascivious carriage. Boom, she goes to the State Farm for Women. So I'm born there in the old Davis building, which you saw the pictures. Which, interesting story, because sometimes when you work overtime as maintenance staff fixing things, I might assist other people. I might not always be doing lock work. So I'm assisting the electrician this one night, and we open the panel, and it's still marked the same as it was in the 50s. And I look at it, it says newborn room, so I go click, and what do I hear from one of the counselors? Hey, where'd my lights go? I go, Paul, look, my first room. But what the interesting story has always been is I look at how life been. I've changed the story a little bit. I lost my mom a little over a year ago, and Audrey, unfortunately, has been in and out of the hospital since the 100th anniversary. Two very different women, two very strong women. But the way I like to honor them is I've had two moms. You know, back when I was about 22 years old, I went to my parents and I said, look, I says, you're my parents, you raised me, I need to find out where I came from. And it was during that time I found out that I was born at a prison. So I went to the old administration building, now known as CPC, the Charlene Perkins Center, and they gave me a legal-sized piece of paper. You know, Freedom of Information Act, it was fairly new, but names were blacked out with magic marker. So I'm, okay, I can beat this. I went to my former high school, saw one of my teachers, said, can I borrow one of your overhead projectors? And blew it up to where I could see through it. From there, I went to Hartford, where a lot of the archives were. And a gentleman gave me a stack of stuff like this to look through. And then kind of looked at me and said, there's a copier over there. I'm like, okay. So I went through it all. I made the copies of what I felt was pertinent. And as I read through it, I learned some things about Audrey, and I learned some things about her background. You know, European parents, old school. She was 14 years younger than her older brother. Strict parents. She had been in trouble, you know, nothing out of the ordinary, where, if you consider it ordinary, you know, shoplifting, little things that in comparison were big things back then. So she got pregnant with Stephanie, ended up there, and it was difficult. It was back and forth. You know, she had a lot of counseling sessions, and ironically, the person that was the superintendent was Janet York. Audrey got out on parole, came back with me, and lost my train of thought for a second. And then after she had me, she wanted to keep me. My older sister Stephanie was adopted by my biological grandmother. She wanted to keep me, and it took 3 years. The state took her to court, proved her an unfit mother. And that's why my family that adopted me waited that 3 years, because initially they were told, we're going to have this child for adoption. So as I'm going through this, I'm looking at where Audrey's from, and it says, oh, they first emigrated to Berwick, Pennsylvania. Now, mind you, I thought they were always in Bridgeport, because that's where I was told they lived. So before the advent of computers and the internet, I decided I'm going to call Town Hall in Berwick, Pennsylvania. And I got the town clerk, and I told her who I was, and I said, I'm trying to find my sister Stephanie. I said, I haven't seen her in a number of years. She said, well, what's her last name? I said, Zontmarie. She goes, oh, I know Stephanie. Let me get you her phone number. Small town. 2 weeks. It took from the day I first went to the old admin building, got the records, and found them. So now all of a sudden, I can go to the doctors and say, I know my medical history. I called Stephanie. We got on one of those three-way calls with Audrey, and Stephanie didn't know it about me, and then found out I had two other sisters. And then years later, I saw an application for a locksmith. I had been a locksmith since I was 16, and life's come full circle. But what I give thanks for is, if any of you know where Nyack Center School is, right next to that is a cemetery. If you pull in the first driveway and you go all the way in back, there's a cemetery. That's where all the York babies are buried. And I go there, and I thank God I'm not one of them. But I had the blessing of being adopted by a wonderful family, being raised with one heritage, but finding out the joy of finding out your biological family and finding out that heritage and that joy. And you know, even my youngest sister, right now, we get together and we start knocking each other around and joking around. Oh, she's pushing me. We never got to do it as kids. So now we're big kids, so now we have fun. The one thing I have always felt appreciative of is twice Audrey was able to return to the prison, to York. One time, shortly after I started, at the time she was living in California. She came home for a while, and Teresa Lance, the commissioner, had given me permission to bring her back through. And so I brought her through, and she was like amazed at all the changes and all the differences. And I arranged for her to have breakfast with Janet York. And I think what I see for her, it put to bed a lot of old ghosts, because a lot of the images she had of Janet in the prison and what it was like was still that youthful thing. And to talk to Janet and talk to her person to person, not superintendent to inmate, I think did a lot of good for her. And then the 100th anniversary, that was VIP invites. It wasn't open to the public event. And when I spoke there, I looked at her and I said, how does it feel to go from inmate to VIP? Because to me, and I shared this then, what I see, I don't see inmates, I see residents. I see troubled children. I see girls who lack self-esteem, maybe lacked positive role models. And just looking at the history of where Audrey started to where she came, and I just have hope for all these women. The one thing I know is people will say, well, how do you address them? I always, greetings, ladies, because to me, they don't deserve to be treated any less than anybody else. I feel I've been blessed because of that whole circle of life. And I jokingly tell my wife, I said, hey, you know, when I die, cremate me and just rent a plane and fly over York and sprinkle the ashes. I said, if the plane sets off a couple of alarms, just move quickly. So, I mean, that's basically a thumbnail sketch. I don't want to keep everybody here too late. But it's a joy to share the story. I jokingly tell my wife it would make an awesome Hallmark movie. So, women's prison, got to appeal to the women's channel. I think it would be great. So, that's basically all I got for tonight.